Okay, so I'm here at the Warwick Economic Summit 2018 with Professor Arun Advani, who's just given a very, very interesting speech on his current research area of, eradicating poverty. Professor, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you very much for inviting me.
So I just want to start with some of the positives, because luckily there are positives in this case. So since 1990, there's been roughly 1 billion people pulled out of absolute poverty around the world, and I just wondered if you had any thoughts on what the main drivers behind that was?
So there's a couple of things. So one thing that's been important in helping reduce poverty has been essentially globalization, for all of the downsides that some people worry about, and there are certainly things we should worry about in terms of labour regulations and these sorts of things. Actually, the fact that more production is being done in countries where there have been more people living, more poorer people living, has actually been a way in which wages have been rising there and has improved things. At the same time, aid has also been an important part of the story. There has been a lot of progress made through governments giving money. I mean, DFID in the UK is a big example of this, where that's improved education and nutritional outcomes by specifically targeting poorer people who are maybe harder to get into work, or particularly children, to try and improve things like education.
Fair enough. And obviously in regards to globalisation, you did mention in the speech that there are some concerns regarding working conditions in factories in, third world, less developed nations, but is that something that we can hope will go away with time, or does there need to be specific attention paid to that, do you think?
No, I mean, I think that is an issue that it's right to be worried about and to think about. And I mean, these sorts of things go away basically when there's demand to force them to go away. So, I mean, child labour was a thing in the UK as well 150 years ago. And it's the fact that ultimately laws were passed that said, okay, children have to go to school up until a certain age, they're not allowed to work up until a certain age or only certain hours. It was those regulations and the enforcement of those regulations that really led to the decline of those problems here. And so if there are other labour regulations that we think are valuable, and there are lots of them that we think are important, like workplace health and safety, like child labour laws, then those are things that we need to have being implemented in more countries. And part of that will have to come from consumers having a demand for that and saying, look, we're not willing to buy from people who are not being consistent with these rules. And only by doing that will you kind of force companies to change things in a world in which individual countries find it hard to change the laws because they're facing a kind of race to the bottom. If one individual country changes a regulation, but it's not changed globally, another country can say, oh, well, why don't you move your factory to us? And so that's where there is something that consumers can do as well.
So yeah, it's very much on consumers to enforce it rather than countries and regulations. Makes a lot of sense. So talking specifically, I guess, about aid now, you obviously wrote a paper recently on the existence of, I think it termed it, network-level poverty traps in poor communities and difficulties in, I guess extending your speech, difficulties in translating the informal insurance networks that you mentioned within poor communities to actually help invest in capital-producing goods that can lead to growth. So I wonder if you could just outline for us briefly the findings of that paper and how they could be applied to microfinances or other aid organisations.
Yeah, so there's a couple of steps there. So the first is that when thinking about poverty traps, apart from a long time ago where there were these ideas of whole countries being in poverty traps, the more recent literature has focused on individual households being in poverty or out of poverty. And so what I was saying in this paper was really maybe that's not the right way to think about it. Maybe we should be thinking of groups of households or networks of households that we know are engaged in informal insurance as being in poverty. So informal insurance is this concept that households group together to be able to say, look, I had a bad outcome, my child is ill or my harvest failed, well, how about you lend me some money? And because we interact with each other a lot of the time, we see each other all the time, that's easy to make that kind of thing happen. And it's beneficial for everybody. You know, when you have a problem, I'll come to you. So one thing is that we should be looking at that level. And so the second part of it is that actually almost can create a negative part. And the negative part is, suppose I do have enough money that I could go and invest. It might be the case that I end up needing to give some of the money to you, even at the point that if I could invest, I could get more money in the future and I could give you money later. So it can have almost a negative consequence that the fact that we are in this informal insurance arrangement makes it harder for individual households to invest. So that can make it difficult. But on the other hand, it also means that when we're thinking about targeting policies to try and get households out of a trap, we should take that network into account and make use of it as a way of trying to increase growth and to allow people within the network to get out of the trap.
Definitely. And I mean, the crux of your speech seemed to be that there was a tipping point within the community. You managed to help a certain number of households, and beyond that it becomes almost self-sustaining. You actually see not just a raise in capital assets from the support itself, but genuine longer term growth in farm animals and other assets. So Is that kind of the lesson here? Is there a certain amount of aid needs to be done before it becomes self-sustaining?
Yeah, I mean, I certainly wouldn't want to draw a general lesson that in all contexts, in all ways, this is the case. Certainly for this program, I think what we learned was that this program was successful in raising incomes, and if you wanted to make incomes not only increase in level, but to create growth, so to create investments so that incomes can rise further in the future, there was this kind of tipping point that we see that when you give enough cows to enough people within a village, in this case it was cows, you see this kind of impact. It's not the case that all contexts will have a production function, have a setup in which this is the right way to think about it. So in some places you might think of, say, migration as being a way of solving things. And migration is clearly a thing an individual can do. They don't need everyone else to migrate necessarily for that to necessarily work. But there are many contexts in which we might think this is a kind of thing that's reasonable.
Fair enough. Okay, just focusing on another part of your speech here, I guess from the Q&A section, it was discussed that there was some controversy in recent years, I think the start of this decade, around microfinance, which was obviously hailed as a game changer in poverty reduction back in the 90s, that, well, as you mentioned, in India, there'd been rising suicide rates over people that found themselves trapped in debt and unable to repay it. So do you think there's things that can be done to reform microfinance such that people don't find themselves in these sort of situations?
Yeah, and so we touched on this earlier. I think there's a couple of things. So one is, like, what's the role of microfinance? And there are a few different things that microfinance can do. So one is it exists as a way of allowing households to borrow to be able to invest. But the other is that being able to borrow money doesn't just let you invest, it also lets you smooth out some of your consumption variation. So if I have a bad income today because my harvest failed, actually borrowing might be a good way of smoothing that out. So there's lots of things that we can see microfinance as being able to do. Then in terms of how we should structure microfinance and what the best way is to kind of avoid some of the problems that you mentioned, so the suicide rates that we saw in the early 2010s. There the problem is trying to get the right level of enforcement. On the one hand, if you have no enforcement for microfinance, nobody is willing to lend, because why would I lend to you if there's no way I can get the money back? On the other hand, we know the mafia are very good at enforcing repayments, but that's not necessarily the right level of enforcement that we want. So we're looking for some level of enforcement that's somewhere in between that allows the situation where a household could invest, might really genuinely be unsuccessful in their investment, and might genuinely be unable to repay. And something like being able to declare bankruptcy effectively, being able to say, okay, there's a condition under which I don't have to repay. That's a valuable thing to happen, because especially if you want investment, and investments are risky, then you need that. If I buy a cow, there's a chance the cow could die. So in that kind of context, you want there to be some ability for people to not necessarily have to repay if things go bad. But at the same point, you want to make sure that most of the time, most people are repaying, because otherwise there won't be any borrowing. And so it's finding that happy medium that's the difficult part.
Definitely. And is there, a role of the state or other large development agencies in backstopping certain microfinance initiatives such that they're willing to put up money so that when a certain portion of loans does fail, that the microfinance organisations can see their money back and they don't go after necessarily vulnerable people that find themselves in a worse situation?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting idea. I think that a lot of microfinance, there's a border between which microfinance organisations have been successful in kind of making enough profit to survive on their own, and which ones end up needing to have some external assistance to be able to make themselves profitable. So, how much kind of non-performing loan can you accept before you either need to have too high an interest rate or before you need to start forcing borrowers to pay? I think that, yeah, you touched on a really nice point that it might be the case that part of the way in which we can improve microfinance is by making more of it even perhaps happen through these kind of non-state or state actors, but who are in here with a non-profit motive and have access to funding from somewhere else that allows them to put up with the fact that some borrowing won't work. Some of it will be unsuccessful. But there's still that balance that you don't want it just to become another form of indirect aid. Because if you're doing that, then maybe if it ends up just being a way of making the transfers, then maybe it's smarter not ever to have made it a loan, but just to have given the money in the first place. So again, it's hard to find that balance, but that's what we're looking for.
Fair enough. So, obviously microfinance is a way of introducing capitalist free market principles into development aid, not just relying on bulk transfers from aid agencies. And that has been a point of discussion recently, is that there's been people contending that a lot of the poverty reduction we've seen, and you mentioned earlier, in the past few years has been through globalization and the establishment of factories and actually creating markets for people to sell stuff on and jobs for them. So looking a bit into the future now, do you think that further globalization on trade, or extended and different forms of specialised development aid is what's going to drive poverty relief in the near future.
So just briefly first touching on the point about microfinance and whether it's sort of introducing free market capitalism. I mean, it's not that people in developing countries didn't try and borrow in some form in some way before. It's just that previously you would go to the one money lender in the village or something, and they would be the only place you could borrow, and they would charge a very high interest rate. And so you would do it if you were really desperate, and the cost of doing it would be very high. So that, markets exist in many contexts, and people form their own markets. And so microfinance might be a way of reducing that cost, and so it can be valuable to do that sort of thing still. I don't think that we should see this as a huge problem per se. Then in terms of the trade-off between kind of aid or trade, I mean, to some extent we shouldn't see it as either or. I mean, trade has done a lot and will continue to do a lot, I think, for making growth happen. Ultimately, we think that integrating countries into a global trading system is a good way to improve incomes over the long term, to allow people to specialize, to work on the things that they're best at doing, and to make use of that as a way of trying to raise everybody's incomes. So we think that's a good thing to do. On the other hand, of course, there will always be contexts in which there are some people for whom this isn't going to be that easy because they won't have the right skills or they will have other constraints. And so aid is still a valuable thing, kind of the way that you would have a welfare state within a given rich country. Yeah. If it's still difficult for a state to organise a welfare state within a poorer country, it might be that aid is part of the way to solve that problem.
Definitely. And I mean, you mentioned in the speech that for certain basic needs and initiatives, actually mass aid does have a role to play. So, for example, in vaccinations, where obviously it's a bulk thing, you need to get immunity over a certain degree before it's effective. So I guess definitely in that context of improving basic incomes, that aid definitely has a role to play.
Yeah, and there again, it's not necessarily the case that it has to be kind of external aid. It could be governments themselves within poor countries being able to do this. So as their institutions improve and they have more state capacity to try and engage in these things themselves, ultimately the aim would be that countries could make these projects happen themselves. So, within the UK, there are vaccines that are offered to babies just as a result of the NHS. It's a thing that automatically happens. It would be nice if something like that would exist in other countries as well. And some places have it, some places don't. And in those places, typically, NGOs will come in and fill the gap. But ultimately, I think what we want is that institutions can get to the point that within a country, they can do it without needing the external help.
Sure. Now, I just want to move on to one final point, maybe a little bit closer to home. Obviously, there's huge amounts of people around the world still in severe poverty, but it's not a foreign constant in developed nations as well. So there were statistics recently released by Shelter showing that now 1 in 200 people in the UK are either sleeping rough or living in extremely inadequate accommodation, and that included a 134% rise since 2010, so obviously the problem's on the increase. Do you think there's any lessons from particularly, as I said, studies of development aid around the world that we can apply to try and eliminate extreme poverty that still exists in developed nations?
I mean, there are some. I would see it differently. So, I mean, there's actually recent work by Angus Deaton on a similar sort of problem in the US, and he does some fairly direct comparisons about what he thinks are the trade-offs between giving aid abroad versus trying to do things at home. I mean, I don't think that that's quite the trade-off I'd like to make. Certainly it's the case that there are lots of problems within the UK, but I think that the place to look for trying to solve those problems isn't necessarily the existing aid budget that goes elsewhere, but within the structure of the welfare state as it already exists. So we already have a welfare state that aims to try to reduce inequality and to reduce poverty in these kinds of ways. And so some of that is making sure that not just the high-minded economics of that works, although there's always ways to improve that, but also to make sure that the practicalities of it works well, so that actually when someone finds themselves homeless and needs to borrow money, needs to get some money because they have nothing to start with, there is a way in which they can, say, sign on as a jobless person and be able to get that money without needing to already have a home that they can say, this is where I live, without needing to have all of those things, and without needing to wait, say, 5 or 6 weeks before their first bit of money comes in. So those are problems that do need to be solved in terms of the practical ways that these things happen. And there are, of course, some things that one could learn from how projects are implemented in developing countries. But I hope that the state capacity within countries like the UK is already great enough that we should be able to solve these problems already.
Definitely.
It's just partly a question of political will and a desire to focus on that as an issue.
Yeah, which is always of importance. Anyway, Professor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you very much.